last part, we left the Gneisenau on the verge of Operation Vesso-Übung, in which she would aid in the invasion of Norway. On April the 7th, 1940, she was ordered to head into the North Sea in company with the Scharnhorst and the heavy cruiser Admiral Hipper, with 14 destroyers as escorts. While in the strait between Denmark and Norway, Hipper would fight off a high-altitude bomber attack, with an even larger one promised, but this failed to materialize. Scharnhorst and Gneisenau would be distant escorts on the western flank for units carrying occupation troops to the main Norwegian ports. While doing this, Scharnhorst and Gneisenau would briefly exchange fire with HMS Renown. Now, I will be using battleships of the Scharnhorst class, the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, the backbone of the German surface forces at the outbreak of the war, by Gerhard Koop and Klaus-Peter Schmolke, who give extracts from the Gneisenau's war diary, written by her commander, so any discrepancies with time can be attributed to the fact that they are reporting in GMT +1. On April the 9th at 2 a.m., radar would report a contact at a range of 25 kilometers on port quarter. Visibility was limited due to rough weather conditions, consisting of intermittent localized snow and hail showers. Even with this, the information was believed to be genuine. At 4:59 a.m., the enemy vessel was spotted, and it was believed to be a battleship of the Nelson class. By 5:05 a.m., muzzle flashes were spotted from what was Renown, with shells falling 300 to 500 meters abeam of the Gneisenau's bridge. At 5:11, the Gneisenau would open fire at a speed of 15.5 knots, later to be increased. At 5:16, speed had increased to 24 knots, and a hit on Renown was observed, being somewhere forward of the bridge. At 5:17, it was reported that the Gneisenau had been hit in return, which had destroyed the No. 2 gunnery officer's targeting site in the forward fire control center. While at 5:19, Gneisenau and the other ships turned to disengage, with the main armament fire control transferred to the aft control position, limiting the main gunnery turret to C turret. At 5:30, the order was given to get the ship up to 27 knots. While at 5:34, the main battery turret A would be out of action due to heavy seas, and would request heavy pumps. At 5:36, it was reported that the Scharnhorst was still firing at the enemy, and from 5:39, it was at a range of 18.4 kilometers. A minute later, two of the leading 150mm portside gun turrets were out of action due to heavy seas. Just to compound this, at 5:41, it was reported that the bridge was on fire. Burning parts were thrown overboard. But at 5:44, it was reported that Renown was turning away, and the aft control had fired 7 salvos. By 5:48, Turret A had finally been reported out of action as shipboard repairs were not possible. At 5:50, the Gneisenau was ordered to reduce speed as Scharnhorst was unable to keep up, with the enemy focusing fire on her. By 6:22, Scharnhorst had finally caught up, and at 6:25, the ships increased speed to 25 knots. For a brief time, the British force was no longer in sight, near 6:45, and a pause in fighting would ensue at 6:49, and observations of the enemy were difficult, as the weather and the seas were very rough by this point. At 7 a.m., shells were observed falling short astern of Scharnhorst. By this point, the engagement was over. HMS Renown would try to keep in contact with the German units, but was forced to cut her speed due to the continual plunging of her bow into the rough seas, which caused flooding on the forecastle deck and the forward main turret. During this engagement, the German forces would obtain 3 hits on Renown, all of which failed to explode. Gneisenau, however, would be hit by a 15-inch shell and 2 4.5-inch shells. The 15-inch shell would destroy the main armament fire control station, killing 5 men and wounding several others. The first 4.5-inch shell would hit A turret and damage the flap covering a rangefinder optic, with the second hitting in the area of an anti-aircraft weapon on the port side aft, adjacent to the superstructure. Nevertheless, Gneisenau would make her way back to Wilhelmshaven and would arrive on the 13th of April, 1940. Eventually, after some moving around to different German ports, on the 5th of May, the ship made its way to the Baltic, heading through the Kiel Canal. But at 11:45, she would hit a mine, exploding on the port side near the rear of the ship. This event would take place during extremely low tide, and no damage was caused, eventually making her way to Kiel around 5 p.m. the following day. During late May, the Gneisenau would go into the eastern Baltic to carry out trials with new anti-mine degaussing gear, newly fitted to the ship, and the anti-aircraft gun crews were exercised as well, eventually returning to Kiel, where she would prepare for a new operation at the beginning of June, codenamed Juno, which would be a sortie by German ships into the North Sea. At 6 in the morning on June the 4th, the Gneisenau would leave Kiel and went into the Baltic, along with the Scharnhorst, the Admiral Hipper, with destroyers and torpedo boats as escorts, and a minesweeper, where they would spend the day exercising and preparing for Operation Juno. The following day, on the 5th, the group would begin to make their way from the Baltic through the Skagerrak into the North Sea, doing so by 7:30 a.m. While maneuvering through the morning, there would be a brief submarine scare at 9:30. However, nothing would come of it. By 4 p.m., the group would be off Lindesnes in Norway, making their way up the coast of Norway. And at 8:25, they were near Utsir, Norway, which is about 120 kilometers south of Bergen. And an hour later, it was reported that the weather had changed to a thick fog for a time, lasting only about an hour. On June the 6th, there was nothing to note besides the ships continuing to move up the coast of Norway. The same would be true for the 7th up until about 8:25 p.m., when the commanders of the fleet would have a conference aboard the flagship, which was the Gneisenau, to discuss their upcoming attack on Harstad and Vagsfjord, which are on the far north of Norway, north of Narvik by about 54 kilometers, in which they discussed their lack of information on the situation, specifically citing mines, net barriers, underwater obstructions, and shore torpedo and gun batteries, as well as the disposition of opposing ships, and the possibility of cooperating with the Luftwaffe for a combined strike. With reports from Norway that they might be making a, quote, stab in the dark, it was suggested that instead the fleet should therefore attack the nearest escorted convoy within range, which was preferred than a blind thrust. At 8:45, the fleet would take a southerly course at a speed of 22 knots. On the 8th at 6:05, they would spot the mast of a steamer to the south, with the Gneisenau making 25 knots by 6:23, and at 6:43, the ship was cleared for battle. The ship would close in on their targets, which turned out to be the oiler Pioneer and the tree-class trawler Juniper, and at 7:05, the secondary battery would open fire on these targets. And with an order to cease fire at 7:09, the Pioneer and Juniper would begin sinking at 7:17, with the Gneisenau already turning away. At 10:02, the Orado 196s aboard the Scharnhorst and Hipper, whom had been launched previously, had spotted a convoy consisting of what was believed to be a cruiser, 2 destroyers, and 3 steamers north of the German fleet, to which the German ships would turn and give chase. The Germans would chase and sink some of the straggling ships, like the transport Orama, but let a hospital ship go unmolested. But at 1:30, the destroyers and the Admiral Hipper would have to be sent to Trondheim to refuel, while the Gneisenau and Scharnhorst would continue north. By 5 p.m., the alarm had sounded. Now, for this upcoming engagement between the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau and the British carrier Glorious and her escorts, the A-class destroyers Acosta and Ardent, I'll be taking an extract from the Scharnhorst War Diary, where at 5:13 they reported seeing Ark Royal and 2 destroyers, but it was Glorious. At 5:30, the secondary battery was firing at the destroyer to the north, Ardent at a range of 14.5 kilometers. While at 5:32, the Scharnhorst main battery was opening fire at Glorious at a range of 26 kilometers, being on target with the 3rd salvo. At 5:35, the ships would turn, and at 5:38, the Gneisenau was now engaging a destroyer. At 5:41, a smokescreen was being laid by the destroyer to obscure the view of the oncoming German battleships, of which I will read the direct extract at this time frame. Destroyer north turning towards. Destroyer south laying smokescreen in front of aircraft carrier. Destroyer north disappearing occasionally from sight behind own smokescreen, but continues firing at us from inside the smoke, and is being most skillfully handled. At 5:45, they would turn to avoid a torpedo. From 5:46 till 5:52, they would continue to maneuver to avoid torpedoes, and describe how effective the British smokescreen was. At 5:58, the Scharnhorst would cease fire due to the smokescreen, but the Gneisenau would continue to fire. More maneuvering to avoid torpedoes would happen, and at 6:04, a hit was reported on a destroyer to the north. At 6:10, Scharnhorst would open fire at the destroyer to the south, while again maneuvering to avoid a torpedo. At 6:17, Glorious was reported to be burning fiercely astern, and a minute later, the main battery reopened up, with the destroyer to the north having a very prominent list. Where at 6:22, they would cease fire on this destroyer as it was sinking. This was the Ardent. At 6:24, after once more maneuvering to avoid a torpedo, Glorious was reported to be burning more fiercely. At 6:26, Scharnhorst's eager secondary battery would bark out without orders to do so against the destroyer to the south, Acosta, which would cease shortly after. At 6:32, the secondary battery would open fire once more against the Acosta, and a minute later, 4 torpedoes would be spotted in the water from the destroyer. With that, at 6:39, the Scharnhorst was hit by a torpedo near sea turret, forcing the flooding of the magazine, and would cause serious damage and inhibit the ship's ability to maneuver and keep up. A detail to be described in a future video on the Scharnhorst. Anyway, to wrap up this battle, the Acosta was reported to be on fire at 7:08, and that they had lost sight of the carrier. Glorious would in fact go down 2 minutes later at 7:10. The Acosta would go down around 10 minutes later, thus concluding the battle. Now, to sum up this blow-by-blow account of this engagement, in this action, the battleships Gneisenau and Scharnhorst would engage and sink the British carrier Glorious and her escorts, the destroyers Acosta and Ardent. Now, after the battle, the two ships would head off to Trondheim to anchor there on the 9th, while on the 11th, the Gneisenau and the Hipper, along with destroyers, would head off into the Norwegian Sea to do an anti-convoy operation, but were deterred by adverse air reconnaissance reports. The next operation would take place on the 20th of June under the command of Vice Admiral Gunter Lütjens, but this ended prematurely when the Gneisenau was hit by a torpedo from the British submarine HMS Clyde, receiving a torpedo hit forward at 11:36 p.m., not seeing the torpedo until a minute before it would actually hit the ship, causing a hole to be torn in the bow so large that a 100-man picket boat could sail through the Gneisenau from one side to the other. After limping back to Trondheim, only makeshift repairs could be made, with neither the Scharnhorst nor the Gneisenau battle-worthy, and with the materials currently available, the Gneisenau could not be restored to full readiness, so this would necessitate the ships to return to Germany. Accordingly, about a month later, on the 25th of July, a squadron was assembled with the Gneisenau being escorted by the light cruiser Nuremberg, 4 destroyers, 4 minesweepers, and 5 torpedoed boats later joined them on the 26th. But the group had barely made it to Stavanger, which is south of Bergen by about 160 kilometers, when the submarine Thames fired a spread of torpedoes at the group, sinking a torpedo boat. Nevertheless, the Gneisenau would enter Kiel on the 30th of July at 1:03 in the morning. She would remain in the shipyard until December, when she then sailed from Kiel on the 28th of December, with the intention of going with Scharnhorst to break out into the Atlantic and operate as a battle group against enemy shipping. An extension of this plan was the addition of Bismarck and Tirpitz later, creating a very powerful squadron. However, with the sinking of Bismarck later, and the basing of Tirpitz in Norway, it would frustrate this plan. But something that would frustrate the immediate plans was when the sortie Gneisenau would engage in was abandoned when the ship received sea damage forward with subsequent flooding. By the 2nd of January, both ships were back in Germany, being moored at Gottenhafen. Now, we will leave the Gneisenau heading back to Kiel to get fully repaired and back to full battle readiness. In the next part, we will look at our operations in the Atlantic. To finish off this video, I will ask you guys to go do something kind for someone else.